Hazel Tells Stories.
I am Willow Carter. 22 years old, and 2 weeks ago, my heart stopped beating in front of 3,000 people. I was walking across my university graduation stage when the relentless Texas heat and months of sleep deprivation finally caught up with me. The stadium lights blurred into a harsh white glare. A sharp, tearing pain ripped through my chest. I gasped, dropping my diploma, and hit the wooden stage hard. The doctors told me later it was stress-induced cardiomyopathy. My heart literally gave out. They needed emergency consent for a cardiac procedure. The hospital staff called my parents 40 times in 2 hours. Every single call went straight to voicemail. When I finally drifted back to consciousness in a sterile, intensive care unit hooked to a maze of monitors and IV drips, my parents were nowhere in sight. The only person sitting beside my hospital bed was my 80-year-old grandmother, Rose. She looked frail under the fluorescent lights, but her hands gripped mine with a quiet, furious strength. Before I could even manage to speak, my phone lit up on the bedside tray. It was an Instagram notification. My older sister, Savannah, had just posted a photo. There they were, Savannah, my mother, Diane, and my father, Greg, all posing on the deck of a rented yacht in Miami. They were wearing designer sunglasses and holding crystal champagne flutes against a beautiful ocean sunset. The caption read, "Bachelorette Weekend Vibes, leaving the Texas drama behind." I lay there in a hospital gown, listening to my own fragile heartbeat on the monitor, realizing my family ignored 40 emergency calls from a surgeon because they were busy day drinking on a boat. Before I continue, if you find this story worth hearing, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Only do it if you genuinely connect with what I am sharing. Drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from and what time it is there. Now let me take you back 4 weeks to show you exactly how I became a ghost in the Carter household. 4 weeks before graduation, I am standing in my childhood kitchen at 6 in the morning. I am exhausted. I work 3 jobs to pay my own tuition, an early shift pulling espresso shots, an afternoon desk job at the campus library, and late-night tutoring sessions. I eat discounted bagels to survive. Meanwhile, my mother sits at the custom marble island buried under a mountain of bridal magazines and expensive fabric swatches. Savannah is marrying a wealthy Dallas real estate developer. Her wedding budget is $80,000 funded entirely by my parents. I pour myself a cup of cheap drip coffee. "Mom," I say, keeping my voice level, "I need to talk to you about graduation. The ceremony is on the 15th. I am graduating summa cum laude." Diane does not even look up from her floral catalog. She flips a glossy page and sighs. "Willow, you are so self-sufficient. You always figure things out. Savannah needs our attention right now. This wedding is her real future." Self-sufficient. That is the word they always use. It is the perfect shield families hide behind when they want to excuse their own neglect. That word hung in the air. Self-sufficient. I left the kitchen that morning and walked straight to my morning shift at the coffee shop. The Texas morning was already thick with humidity. My sneakers were worn thin at the soles. I could feel the heat radiating from the pavement with every step. I had exactly $42 in my checking account. That money had to cover groceries for the next 10 days. When I arrived at the cafe, the reality of my life settled over me like a heavy blanket. I tied on my apron and started pulling espresso shots. My feet ached before the sun even fully cleared the horizon. Between serving customers, I huddled in the back room with my battered laptop typing frantic paragraphs for my sociology honors thesis. My research focused on the generational impacts of socioeconomic disparity. The irony was not lost on me. I was living my research every single day. Suddenly, the screen of my laptop flickered. A harsh, buzzing sound came from the fan, and then the screen went black. I pressed the power button again and again. Nothing happened. Panic rose in my throat. Every page of my research, every data point I needed to graduate, was trapped inside that dead machine. I had backups on a cloud server, but I had no way to access them to finish the writing. I rushed to the campus tech repair center during my lunch break. The technician ran a diagnostic and gave me a sympathetic look. The motherboard was failing. He could salvage the data and install a temporary fix, but it would cost $300. $300 might as well have been $1 million. I walked out of the tech center feeling like the ground had vanished beneath my feet. That afternoon, I had no choice. I had to swallow my pride and do the one thing I promised myself I would never do. I had to ask my parents for financial help. I drove to my parents' house after my evening shift at the library. I found my father Greg sitting in his home office. He was reviewing spreadsheets on a dual monitor setup. Greg is a regional manager for an insurance firm. He prides himself on looking like an executive. He wears tailored shirts, even on weekends. I knocked on the open door frame. He glanced up, his expression instantly shifting to mild annoyance. Dad, I need to ask you a favor, I say, my voice tight. My laptop died today. I need it to finish my thesis and graduate. The repair is $300. I do not have it. I get paid next Friday, and I can pay you back every single cent. I just need a short-term loan. Greg sighed, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. Willow, you know we are spread incredibly thin right now. Savannah is marrying Preston next month. Preston comes from a very prominent Dallas family. We have an image to uphold. The floral deposits alone just doubled. We simply do not have any liquid cash to spare. I stared at him. The house we lived in had 5 bedrooms and a pool. He drove a luxury sedan. You do not have $300, I asked softly, for my education. You need to learn financial responsibility, he replied, his tone shifting into a lecture. You chose to go to a university we could not fully subsidize. We told you to go to community college. This is the consequence of living beyond your means. Maybe you should ask the library for an advance on your paycheck. My chest tightened. I was working 25 hours a week while taking 18 credit hours. I was not living beyond my means. I was barely surviving. Before I could defend myself, the front door downstairs banged open. The sound of high heels echoed up the hardwood stairs. Savannah strutted into the office. She did not even acknowledge I was standing there. She dropped a sleek black shopping bag onto Greg's desk. Savannah is 3 years older than me, but she acts like she is the center of the universe. She has our mother's bright blonde hair and a smile she uses to get whatever she wants. Dad, look what I found, Savannah squealed. She pulled out a pair of custom designer heels from the bag. They were encrusted with tiny crystals. I need these for the rehearsal dinner. The boutique in Houston rushed the order for me. She slid a piece of paper across his keyboard. It was the receipt. I could see the bold print at the bottom. $1,250. I held my breath, waiting for Greg to give her the same lecture about tight budgets and financial responsibility. I waited for him to tell her they were spread too thin. Instead, Greg smiled. He picked up one of the shoes and admired it. These are stunning, sweetie. Preston's mother will be very impressed. Just put the receipt on the pile. I will transfer the funds to your credit card tomorrow. $1,200 for shoes to wear to a dinner. $300 for the computer I needed to graduate college. I stood frozen. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating. It was not just about the money, it was about the message. My future, my education, my basic ability to function meant absolutely nothing compared to Savannah's aesthetic. If you have ever been told there are no resources for your basic needs only to watch someone else receive endless luxuries, let me know in the comments. Tell me I am not the only one who has felt that specific, burning kind of rejection. I turned around and walked out of the office without another word. Greg did not call after me. He was too busy asking Savannah about her dress fittings. I retreated to my small bedroom down the hall. I sat on the edge of the mattress, my mind racing. I needed a plan to fix my computer. I decided I would sell my bicycle and walk to work for the next month. It was humiliating, but I had no other option. I was just pulling up a local resale website on my phone when my mother, Diane, pushed my door open. She did not knock. Willow, I need you to do something for your sister, Diane announced. Her tone was not a request. It was an order. Savannah forgot to pick up the hand-lettered place cards from the calligrapher in downtown Houston. The shop closes at 5 today. You need to go get them right now. I looked at the clock on my nightstand. It was 3:30 in the afternoon. Downtown Houston was an hour away in traffic. I have a meeting with my thesis advisor at 4, I say. If I miss it, I lose a letter grade on my final project. Savannah has her own car. She is not working today. She can go get them herself. Diane narrowed her eyes. Do not be selfish, Willow. Savannah is stressed out. She is dealing with caterers and seating charts. You only have to worry about your little school project. Family steps up for family. My little school project. I had maintained a perfect grade point average for 4 years. I had earned the honor of giving the valedictorian address. To my mother, it was just a little project. I cannot go, Mom. I am sorry, but I really cannot miss this meeting. I grabbed my backpack and stood up. Diane blocked the doorway. If you walk out that door and refuse to help your sister, do not bother asking us for any favors when you graduate. We are spending a fortune to give Savannah the start she deserves. You should be grateful we even let you live here rent-free. I pushed past her. The irony was suffocating. I paid for my own car insurance, my own groceries, and my own tuition. The only thing they provided was a bedroom they constantly threatened to take away. I rode my bike to campus in the sweltering heat, tears mixing with the sweat on my face. I made my advisor meeting. I sold my bike the next day to a freshman for $250. I pawned a pair of silver earrings Grandma Rose had given me for my 16th birthday. To make up the rest, I got my laptop fixed. I finished my thesis. I survived. Because that is what I do. I survive. But surviving is not living. And that week, something fundamental shifted inside me. I realized that keeping my head down and working hard was never going to earn their respect. They were never going to wake up one day and suddenly see my worth. I decided I was done hiding in the shadows of Savannah's wedding. The university mailed out the official commencement invitations later that week. Each graduating senior received 3 embossed heavy cardstock tickets for VIP family seating. I held them in my hands, feeling the raised gold lettering. These tickets represented 4 years of solitary struggle. They represented every early morning shift and every skipped meal. I decided to force their hand. I was going to put these tickets right in front of their faces. I was going to demand they acknowledge my achievement. I wanted to see if they would finally choose me just for one day. I did not know it yet, but placing those tickets on the kitchen table was about to ignite the confrontation that would shatter our family forever. 3 weeks before graduation, I stood at the top of the stairs holding the 3 commencement invitations. The cardstock was thick and heavy in my hands. The gold foil seal caught the morning light filtering through the hallway window. I traced my name printed in elegant script. Willow Carter, summa cum laude. This was the proof of my existence. This was the tangible result of every sleepless night and skipped meal. I took a deep breath and walked down the steps. The kitchen was already a whirlwind of activity. Greg sat at the custom marble island, scrolling through his tablet. He wore his crisp weekend golf attire, a fresh cup of coffee steaming beside his elbow. Across the room, Diane was pacing. She had her phone pressed to her ear, arguing with a vendor about the exact shade of ivory for the reception table linens. In the corner, sitting quietly by the bay window, was Grandma Rose. Rose is my father's mother. She grew up on a dusty cattle ranch in West Texas and married my grandfather, a man who turned a small hardware store into a regional empire. She possesses a quiet, sharp intelligence that Diane has always found intimidating. Rose was visiting for the month leading up to the wedding. She spent most of her time observing the chaos, sipping herbal tea, and keeping her thoughts locked tight behind her pale blue eyes. I walked over to the island. I placed the 3 envelopes gently in front of my father. The soft thud of the paper hitting the marble sounded deafening to my own ears. Greg glanced up, his brow furrowing. "What is this?" "Dad," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Graduation is the 15th. I am graduating at the top of my class. I have 3 reserved seats for the VIP family section." I watched his eyes drop to the embossed letters. For a fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of genuine surprise. He did not even know my class rank. He had never asked. But the surprise quickly dissolved into a tense, uncomfortable grimace. He pushed the envelopes back across the smooth stone surface. "Honey," he said, his tone adopting that familiar patronizing cadence. "The 15th is Savannah's Miami trip. We booked the resort and the flights months ago." The air vanished from my lungs. The kitchen suddenly felt very small and too bright. I stared at him, trying to process the words. "You booked a vacation on my graduation weekend. You knew I was graduating in May." Diane ended her call with a sharp tap to her screen. She marched over to the island, her heels clicking aggressively against the tile. She crossed her arms, staring down at the invitations like they were an offensive piece of trash left on her counter. "Oh, stop being so dramatic," Willow Diane scoffed. "The college mails your diploma anyway. It is just a piece of paper. You are walking across a stage for 10 seconds. Savannah is marrying into the Covington family. Preston has aunts and uncles flying into Miami from old money estates in Connecticut. We have to network with his family. We have to make the right impression." I looked from my mother to my father. Greg was already looking back down at his tablet, swiping to a new screen. He was washing his hands of the conversation. "You are missing my college graduation for a bachelorette party," I whispered. My voice cracked, betraying the stoic armor I tried so hard to maintain. "I am your daughter. I am giving the valedictory address." Diane rolled her eyes, picking up her coffee cup. "And we are very proud of you, Willow. But you have to look at the bigger picture. A sociology degree does not open doors the way a Covington alliance does. You are smart. You will find a nice entry-level job. Savannah is securing her future, and by extension, she is securing our social standing. Do not be selfish and demand attention when your sister needs our support." The betrayal was a physical ache behind my ribs. It was not just that they were skipping the ceremony, it was the calculated, deliberate choice. They had planned this Miami trip months in advance. They had checked their calendars, saw the second week of May, and actively chose to ignore what that timeline meant for their youngest daughter. They prioritized sipping cocktails on a yacht with strangers over watching me achieve the highest academic honor at my university. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the marble island. I wanted to tear down the floral arrangements Diane had scattered around the room. My hands shook. I reached out and gathered the 3 invitations, sliding them back into my bag. As I turned to leave the kitchen, I caught Grandma Rose's eye. She had not said a single word during the entire exchange. She sat perfectly still in her armchair, her porcelain teacup resting on her lap, but her eyes were blazing. I walked past the bay window toward the hallway. Rose reached out. Her hand was thin, her skin like delicate parchment, but her grip was surprisingly strong. She caught my wrist and pulled me down, so I was forced to lean in close to her chair. She looked past my shoulder, ensuring Greg and Diane were arguing over a vendor contract and paying no attention to us. "Smart does not buy a country club membership," Rose whispered to me, her voice a dry, raspy drawl that mocked my mother's pretentious logic. "But Smart gives you freedom, and freedom, my girl, is priceless." I looked into her weathered face. There was a dangerous glint in her pale blue eyes. It was a look of cold, calculated resolve. "Let them go to Miami," she continued, her voice so low only I could hear. "Let them drink their champagne and pretend they are royalty. They are fools building a house on sand. You focus on your final exams. I will be in that front row. And I promise you, Willow, the view is going to be spectacular." She squeezed my hand one last time and released me. I stood up, my heart pounding a different rhythm now. That was the very first hint that Grandma Rose had a plan. I did not know what kind of leverage she possessed, but the quiet certainty in her voice acted like a lifeline thrown into dark water. I walked out of the house and got into my old beat-up sedan. I gripped the steering wheel, replaying her words. "Freedom is priceless." I drove to campus for my afternoon shift, my mind racing. I told myself I could handle the rejection. I told myself I did not need Greg or Diane to validate my existence. But the human body can only absorb so much betrayal before it begins to break down. You can force your mind to be strong, but your heart bears the physical weight of the trauma. The next morning, the physical toll began to manifest in ways I could no longer ignore. I was standing behind the library circulation desk when Savannah walked in. She never came to the library. She hated the academic side of campus. She marched up to my counter, dropping a stack of heavily scented envelopes in front of me. "I need you to mail these custom rehearsal dinner invitations," Savannah demanded, not even bothering to say hello. "The post office on the corner has the specific vintage stamps I want. Mom said you get off work at noon." I stared at the envelopes, then up at my sister. Her sense of entitlement was a living, breathing entity in the room. "I am not doing your errands, Savannah," I said evenly. "I have to study." Savannah scoffed, leaning over the counter. "You are so bitter. Just because Mom and Dad would rather spend a weekend in Miami with fun people instead of sitting in a hot stadium watching you get a pointless degree. You are just jealous." A sudden sharp spike of pain radiated through my left shoulder. It was fast and hot, like a needle piercing the muscle. I flinched, bringing my hand up to my chest. My breath hitched. Savannah rolled her eyes, oblivious to my reaction. "Stop faking a panic attack to get out of doing a simple favor. Just buy the stamps, Willow. It will not kill you to be helpful for once." She spun on her heel and walked out of the library. I leaned against the counter, waiting for the shooting pain to subside. My vision blurred slightly at the edges. I told myself it was just a muscle cramp. I told myself it was just anxiety. I had to keep going. The pressure was mounting, and the real physical collapse was only days away. 2 weeks before graduation, the sharp spike of pain I felt in the library transformed from an isolated incident into a daily haunting. My body started sending me blaring warning signs, but I refused to listen. I lived on the 3rd floor of an aging apartment building near the edge of the university campus. The building had no elevator. Every single afternoon, carrying my heavy canvas backpack up those 3 flights of concrete stairs felt like navigating a steep mountain. By the time I reached the 2nd floor landing, my vision would narrow into a tight tunnel. Dark spots danced at the periphery of my sight. I would have to stop and grip the rusted iron railing, forcing air into my burning lungs, while my heart fluttered erratically against my ribs. I blamed the Texas heat. I blamed the cheap drip coffee I survived on. I blamed the endless cycle of double shifts at the cafe and late nights at the library. I had final exams approaching, a grueling thesis defense to prepare for, and rent due on the 1st of the month. My landlord did not care about my blood pressure, and the university billing department did not care about my chest pains. I had to keep moving forward. In the Carter household, showing physical weakness was an unforgivable sin. I learned this lesson very early in life. I remember being 12 years old, shivering under a thin blanket with a raging fever. Diane opened my bedroom door, handed me a plastic cup of generic cough syrup, and told me to keep my door shut because she was hosting a charity luncheon downstairs. My illness was framed as a personal inconvenience to her social calendar. Contrast that with Savannah. When Savannah was 15 and suffered a mild sunburn during a summer cheerleading camp, Greg hired a private dermatologist to visit our house. Diane bought her silk pajamas so her skin would not chafe. They treated Savannah's minor discomfort like a national emergency. They treated my genuine suffering like an irritating distraction. I internalized that dynamic so deeply it became my survival mechanism. If you are not perfect and silent, you are a burden. I trained myself to swallow my pain. I did not want to give my parents another reason to call me difficult. I did not want to hand them an excuse to roll their eyes and walk away. If you have ever ignored your own physical suffering because you were too busy trying to prove your worth to people who would never notice anyway, drop the word invisible in the comments. I know how it hollows you out inside. I know the quiet devastation of fighting a battle in a room full of people who refuse to look at you. It was a Tuesday evening when the pressure finally cracked my fragile foundation. I was sitting at my tiny kitchen table. Textbooks, highlighted research papers, and index cards were spread across the cheap laminate surface. The air conditioning in my apartment was broken. I could not afford the repair fee, so I sat in the stifling heat, a small desk fan pushing warm air across my face. My chest felt incredibly tight, harboring a dull ache that radiated down my left arm and pooled in my fingertips. My phone buzzed against the wood of the table. I ignored it, keeping my eyes glued to my sociology notes. It buzzed again, then a third time. The relentless vibration rattled a plastic pen off the edge of the table. I sighed, rubbing my aching sternum, and picked up the device. It was a string of messages from Savannah. She never started a conversation with a greeting. She simply issued commands. I need you to hand letter 300 place cards by Friday. The first message read. The boutique calligrapher backed out. My wedding planner said you have nice handwriting. Pick up the premium cardstock for my house tomorrow morning. Make sure you use gold ink. I stared at the glowing screen, reading the words over and over. 300 place cards. Each card would require careful measuring, precise lettering, and drying time. It was a minimum of 15 hours of meticulous, unpaid labor. She was demanding this right in the middle of my final exams week. She wanted me to sacrifice my academic future to ensure her reception tables looked aesthetically pleasing for her wealthy guests. I looked at the stack of index cards in front of me. I was reviewing the impact of redlining on generational wealth. I needed to memorize 40 pages of data before Thursday. If I drove to Houston, picked up the cardstock, and spent 15 hours drawing perfect cursive letters in gold ink, I would fail my defense. My scholarship required maintaining my grade point average. Failing was not an option. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. For 22 years, I had bent over backwards to accommodate her. I had folded her laundry, covered her chores, and stayed quiet while she consumed every ounce of our parents' affection. But sitting in that hot apartment, feeling my heart laboring just to pump blood through my veins, I reached my absolute limit. I typed back a response. My fingers felt clumsy and strangely cold. Savannah, I am physically exhausted. I am studying for my thesis defense. I cannot do this. I hit send and dropped the phone face down on the table. My heart began to hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs, anticipating the inevitable fallout. Setting a boundary in my family was the equivalent of dropping a lit match into dry brush. Less than a minute later, the screen illuminated the dark room again. I slowly turned the phone over. Her response was a single block of text designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. Selfish, as always, the message read, you only ever think about yourself. This is exactly why Mom and Dad are going to Miami instead of sitting in a hot bleacher watching you get a meaningless degree. You do not care about this family, so do not expect this family to care about you. The words hit me like a physical strike to the chest. The breath rushed out of my lungs in a sharp gasp. It was not just the cruelty of the insult that stung, it was the devastating confirmation of what I already suspected. My parents' decision to skip my graduation was not just a scheduling conflict, it was an active punishment sanctioned and weaponized by my sister. Savannah was explicitly telling me that their presence had to be earned through servitude. Because I refused to be her free labor, I deserved to be abandoned on my graduation day. The dull ache in my left arm flared into a sharp, terrifying spike of heat. The room tilted. I dropped the phone, letting it clatter against the floorboards. I pressed the heel of my hand hard against my breastbone, trying to massage away the crushing, suffocating pressure. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I could hear the rushing sound of my own pulse pounding in my ears. I stood up, my knees trembling so hard I had to grab the edge of the table to steady myself. I stumbled to the bathroom sink. I turned on the cold water faucet and splashed handfuls of water over my face. My reflection in the mirror looked hollow and foreign. My skin was a pale, sickly gray, pulling tight across my cheekbones. Dark, bruised shadows hung under my eyes. I looked like a ghost. I opened the medicine cabinet with shaking hands. I found a plastic bottle of over-the-counter painkillers. I tipped 2 pills into my palm and swallowed them dry, wincing as they scratched the back of my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the porcelain edges of the sink until my knuckles turned white. I told myself I just needed to survive the next 14 days. I told myself the chest pain was just heartbreak manifesting as physical discomfort. I thought the worst part of this ordeal was the emotional rejection. I had no idea that the real danger was still coming. I did not know that less than 24 hours later, my father was preparing to deliver a threat that would push my failing heart past the point of no return. The morning of the ultimatum arrived with a suffocating layer of coastal humidity pressing against the windows of the cafe. I dragged myself behind the counter for my early shift, my uniform clinging to my damp skin. Every movement felt like wading through deep water. The dull ache in my chest had evolved overnight into a persistent squeezing pressure. My hands trembled as I locked the espresso portafilter into the machine. I focused on the mechanical hiss of the steam wand and the sharp scent of roasted coffee beans, trying to ground myself in the physical reality of my job. I just had to make it through this shift. Tomorrow was my final thesis presentation. After that, the academic marathon would finally be over. The mid-morning rush had finally cleared out, leaving the cafe relatively quiet. I was standing near the pickup window wiping down the sticky laminate counter with a damp towel when my cell phone vibrated in my apron pocket. I pulled it out and saw my father's name flashing on the screen. Greg rarely called me during the day unless he needed something specific. He treats phone calls like corporate memos, delivering instructions with zero pleasantries. I hit accept and pressed the phone to my ear. "Hello, Dad," Willow Greg said, his voice clipped and tight. "Savannah is having a meltdown about her bachelorette party favors. The boutique in Houston just called. The custom silk robes are ready, but their courier service canceled. We need you to drive down there tomorrow morning to pick them up and bring them back before our flight to Miami." I gripped the damp towel, the cafe around me seeming to tilt slightly. Houston was a 3-hour drive each way. Factor in the brutal midday traffic, and he was asking me to spend my entire Thursday running an errand for a party I was not even invited to. "Dad, tomorrow is my final thesis presentation," I said, keeping my tone as even as possible. "I present to the department head at 11 in the morning. This presentation determines my final grade and my honors status. I cannot drive to Houston tomorrow." There was a brief pause on the line. I knew that pause. It was the space where Greg recalibrated his argument to find the most effective angle of guilt. My father is a regional manager for a major insurance firm. He builds his entire career on risk assessment policy enforcement and finding the leverage in any negotiation. He views family dynamics through the exact same lens. He does not ask for favors. He demands compliance and he punishes deviation. "Willow, your sister is stressed beyond belief," Greg countered, his voice dropping into a patronizing register. "This yacht trip is a major networking event for her new family. Those robes are for the bridal party photos. You only have to read a paper to some professors. You can ask them to reschedule." I stared at the espresso machine, my reflection distorted in the polished chrome. He wanted me to ask a panel of university academics to reschedule a senior thesis defense so I could fetch silk garments for a photo shoot. The sheer absurdity of the demand took my breath away. "I cannot reschedule a university panel, Dad. The date has been set for 6 months. Savannah will have to find another way to get her robes." The temperature of his voice plummeted. His corporate patience evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hard edge. "You know, Willow, this family operates on mutual support. We step up for each other. If you cannot be a team player for this family, then we cannot support you. Support me." A laugh clawed its way up my throat. It was a bitter, hollow sound that echoed slightly in the empty cafe. The injustice of his words burned like acid. I looked down at my worn sneakers and my stained apron. I thought about the bicycle I sold just to fix my laptop. I thought about the discounted bagels I lived on while they funded an $80,000 wedding. "You do not support me, Dad," I fired back, my voice trembling under the strain of my own suppressed anger. "I pay my own rent. I pay for my own groceries. I cover my own tuition through scholarships and tips from this counter. I have not asked you for a single dime in 4 years. You literally have nothing left to hold over my head." I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. I had bruised his ego. Greg hates being reminded of his lack of control. He needs to feel like the benevolent provider even when he provides nothing. He went quiet for a few seconds, searching through his mental files for the one string he still held, the one tether he had not yet cut. "We pay your health insurance," he barked back, the triumph evident in his sudden change of pitch. "You are on my corporate policy. You think you are so independent. You think you do not need us. But if you are going to be this disrespectful, if you are going to sabotage your sister's weekend over a stubborn grudge, then I am dropping you from the policy today." My heart stumbled. The squeezing pressure in my chest flared into a hot, radiating ache. "You would not do that," I breathed the reality of his threat crashing down on me. "Watch me," he replied smoothly. "Figure it out yourself, adult." The line went dead. I lowered the phone from my ear. The silence in the cafe felt oppressive. I stood frozen behind the counter, the damp towel slipping from my fingers to the floor. My chest was heaving. I tried to pull air into my lungs, but the oxygen felt thin and useless. I pulled open a browser on my phone with shaking thumbs. I navigated to the portal for my father's insurance provider. My login credentials were saved. I watched the loading circle spin, my pulse thudding a painful, erratic rhythm against my collarbone. The screen populated. There, in bold red letters next to my name, were 2 devastating words. Coverage terminated. He actually did it. 1 week before I would collapse on a graduation stage. 1 week before I would need emergency heart surgery to save my own life. My father logged into his corporate benefits portal and canceled my health insurance to punish me for not fetching silk robes for a party they were attending instead of my commencement. The cruelty of the act was paralyzing. He stripped away my basic medical security to teach me a lesson about obedience. In American society, losing health coverage is not a minor inconvenience. It is a financial death sentence. Without insurance, a single emergency room visit can mean a lifetime of crippling debt. I was standing there actively experiencing the symptoms of a failing heart, and my father had just removed my only safety net. I leaned heavily against the back counter, clutching my chest. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. The edges of the cafe began to blur, washing out into a hazy gray. The pain radiating down my left arm was no longer a dull ache. It was a sharp, burning warning. My body was breaking down, and now I had no way to afford a doctor. I was trapped in a nightmare of their making. I closed my eyes and tried to force my heart rate to slow down. I needed a lifeline. I could not fight this battle alone anymore. Greg and Diane had made their position clear. They would gladly watch me drown if it meant keeping Savannah's luxury yacht afloat. I opened my contacts list, my vision swimming. I scrolled past my parents' numbers, past my sister's number. I stopped on a contact I had saved under a favorite star. I tapped the screen and held the phone to my ear, listening to the dial tone. I did not know how much time I had left before my body gave out entirely, but I knew I had to make this call. I needed the one person in the Carter family who understood the true meaning of leverage. I needed Grandma Rose. That night, the stifling heat of my apartment felt heavier than ever. I sat on my faded, second-hand couch, pulling my knees up to my chin. The tears came in relentless waves, racking my frame until my ribs physically ached. Every sob triggered a sharp warning flutter behind my sternum. I was 22 years old, alone, and entirely unmoored. I kept staring at the insurance termination email glowing on my laptop screen. In America, lacking medical coverage is not merely a bureaucratic hurdle. It is a terrifying tightrope walk without a net. A single emergency room visit could saddle me with 6 figures of debt before I even received my diploma. My father knew this. He weaponized my physical safety to force compliance. He wagered my health against my sister's vanity. The sudden blare of my ringtone pierced the quiet room. I flinched, wiping my damp cheeks with the back of my hand. I reached for the device, expecting another hostile demand from my mother or a mocking text from Savannah. Instead, the caller ID displayed Grandma Rose. I tapped the green icon and held the phone to my ear, trying to steady my breathing. I did not want her to hear the panic ravaging my voice. "Hello," I managed to whisper. "Willow, sweetheart," Rose said, her voice crackling slightly over the line. "You sound terrible." I tried to swallow the lump in my throat. I wanted to be strong. I wanted to embody the resilience she always praised. But the sheer weight of the day broke my resolve. I opened my mouth and the truth poured out. I told her everything. I explained the demand to drive to Houston the day before my thesis defense. I detailed Savannah's cruel text message. I recounted the conversation with Greg, repeating his cold, calculated threat. Finally, I choked out the reality of the canceled health insurance policy. I told her I was sitting in my hot apartment experiencing genuine, terrifying chest pains with absolutely no way to afford a doctor. I waited for her to offer gentle condolences. I expected her to sigh and tell me my parents meant well, but had lost their perspective. That is the standard script families use to gloss over toxic behavior. Rose did not sigh. She went dead silent. The quiet stretching across the cellular connection felt charged like the heavy atmosphere right before a Texas thunderstorm breaks. To understand Rose, you have to understand my late grandfather, Henry. Henry was a self-made man who built a logistics company from a single delivery truck. He possessed a razor-sharp instinct for reading people. He spotted weaknesses and calculated risks long before anyone else in the room realized a game was being played. He loved my father, Greg, but he never respected him. Henry saw through Greg's corporate posturing and Diane's social climbing. He knew their obsession with status would eventually eclipse their basic humanity. When Rose finally spoke, her tone had transformed entirely. The frail grandmotherly warmth vanished. Her voice was pure, unyielding steel. Your grandfather knew this would happen, she stated carefully. The words sent a chill down my spine. Henry watched Diane fawn over Savannah while pushing you into the shadows. Rose continued. He saw Greg enable that behavior to keep the peace. Before your grandfather passed away, he made specific arrangements. He left a secure lockbox at a private bank in Dallas registered solely in my name. I gripped the phone tighter, my pulse thudding against my wrist. What kind of arrangements? I asked. He instructed me to wait until you officially graduated university to hand it over. Rose explained. Henry knew the exact legal mechanisms required to bypass your parents. If he transferred anything to you while you were a minor or while you were still dependent on them for shelter during college, Diane and Greg would find a loophole. They would drain it to fund Savannah's lifestyle. He made graduation the trigger event because it marked your legal and financial independence. I sat up straight, ignoring the dull ache radiating down my left arm. Grandma, what is inside the box? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Leverage, she replied simply, and a way out. I did not want to execute this until the ceremony, but your father crossed a line today that cannot be uncrossed. Weaponizing your medical care is unforgivable. I am driving to the bank branch tomorrow morning when their doors open. I was stunned. A mix of intense hope and visceral terror flooded my system. My entire life, I believed I had nothing. I believed my sheer willpower was my only asset. Now a hidden mechanism was clicking into place, orchestrated by a man who had been gone for 5 years. Listen to me very closely, Willow Rose continued, her tone commanding. You are going to walk into that thesis defense tomorrow and secure your honors ranking. You are going to ignore every phone call from your father. Do not engage with your sister. You focus entirely on finishing the race. I will be sitting in the front row of that stadium on Saturday. Do not let those people steal your light. I will be there, I promised, fighting through a fresh wave of tears. This time, they were not tears of despair. They were tears of validation. Someone saw me. Someone had always seen me, even from beyond the grave. I ended the call and lowered the phone to my lap. The apartment was still dark and sweltering. My chest still harbored a dangerous, erratic rhythm. But the psychological landscape had shifted dramatically. Whatever leverage Grandma Rose was retrieving from that Dallas vault, my parents knew absolutely nothing about it. They were currently packing their designer luggage, anticipating a glamorous weekend in Miami, entirely oblivious to the trapdoor opening beneath their feet. Greg thought he held all the cards because he controlled a corporate insurance portal. Diane thought she won because she successfully prioritized a bachelorette party over my academic triumph. They operated under the assumption that I was isolated, vulnerable, and easy to discard. They had no idea that their cruelty had just activated a failsafe. I spent the rest of the night lying awake on the worn cushions of the couch. Sleep was impossible. Every time I drifted off, my heart would stumble, jolting me awake with a frantic breath-stealing palpitation. I placed my hand flat against my sternum, feeling the irregular thumping. I had to survive the next 48 hours. I dragged myself into the bathroom as the sun began to rise, painting the Texas sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. I stared at my reflection. I had to look like a competent, composed honors student today, not a medical emergency waiting to happen. I applied cheap concealer under my eyes to mask the dark hollows. I pulled my hair into a tight, severe bun. I buttoned a thrifted white blouse, my fingers trembling so badly I missed the buttonholes twice. I practiced my breathing, forcing slow, deliberate inhales. Just get through the presentation, just secure the grade. I took the public bus to campus, clutching my presentation notes. My chest felt like it was wrapped in tight iron bands. When I stood before the sociology department panel at 11 o'clock, the lecture hall lights glaring down on me, I used every ounce of my remaining adrenaline to push the pain aside. I delivered a flawless defense on socioeconomic disparities and systemic neglect. I spoke with a clarity and conviction born directly from my own lived nightmare. When the panel nodded in approval and formally granted my highest honors designation, I did not feel joy. I only felt a grim, desperate relief. I walked out of the academic building, gripping the stone railing of the steps to steady my shaking legs. I pulled out my phone. A text from Grandma Rose sat on my lock screen. It was a single sentence. "The box is secured. See you Saturday." I locked the screen, the iron bands around my chest tightening further. The stage was set. The leverage was in play. I just had to survive the walk across the graduation stage. Graduation morning arrived wrapped in a suffocating blanket of coastal humidity. I opened my eyes and immediately gasped, my fingers clutching the thin bedsheets. The dull ache that had been sitting behind my sternum for 2 weeks had sharpened into a hot, jagged blade. Every inhale felt restricted, as if a heavy weight rested directly on my lungs. I swung my legs over the edge of the mattress and waited for the room to stop spinning. The Texas sun was already beating against the window panes, promising a relentless, sweltering day. I forced myself to stand. I walked to my narrow closet and pulled out the cheap cotton dress I found on a thrift store clearance rack. Next to it hung my graduation gown. I bought it secondhand from an alumni message board online. The hem was slightly frayed and the black fabric had faded to a dark charcoal gray after years of use. For a long moment, I ran my hand over the synthetic material. This garment represented 4 years of relentless grinding. It was the physical manifestation of early morning barista shifts, late-night library hours, and a perfect academic record built entirely without a safety net. I slipped the dress over my head, my arms feeling heavy and remarkably uncoordinated. My phone vibrated against the cracked porcelain of the bathroom sink. I braced myself, staring at the glowing screen. I expected a message from Grandma Rose confirming her arrival at the venue. Instead, the notification displayed a photo message from my mother, Diane. I picked up the device, my hands trembling. The image loaded and the remaining breath left my lungs. The photo showed the interior of a plush airline first-class cabin. Diane sat in a wide leather seat holding a crystal flute filled with orange juice and champagne. She wore a tailored linen travel suit that cost more than my entire semester of textbooks. Greg sat beside her, looking more relaxed than I had seen him in a decade. He wore his expensive vacation clothes, offering a casual smile to the camera. Savannah leaned over from the row behind them, thrusting her left hand forward so her diamond engagement ring caught the cabin lighting. They were beaming. Beneath the image was a short string of text. Flight bumped up. Having mimosas at the airport. Have fun today. Send pics. I stared at the glowing pixels. There was no expression of love. There was no acknowledgement of the incredible academic honor I was about to receive. It was a breezy, careless dismissal of my literal blood, sweat, and tears. I zoomed in on my mother's face. Diane grew up in a cramped, noisy duplex with 3 siblings and a mother who worked night shifts. She clawed her way into the upper middle class through her marriage to Greg and spent the rest of her life trying to scrub away the gritty reality of her origins. Savannah was her masterpiece, a flawless socialite marrying into elite money. I was the rough draft she wanted to hide. I was the daughter who worked a service job and bought used clothes. Looking at that photo, a profound realization washed over me. I finally understood why they looked so genuinely joyful in that airplane cabin. My absence removed the only mirror reflecting their parental failures. Without me standing there demanding basic decency and emotional support, they could play the role of the perfect, carefree family. They did not have to feel guilty about spending $80,000 on a wedding while I ate discounted bagels to survive. They were happy because I was not there to ruin their carefully curated aesthetic. I typed out a response in the text box. I wanted to tell them my chest was burning. I wanted to tell them I was terrified that something was medically wrong with my heart, but my thumb hovered over the send button and I stopped. Showing vulnerability to Diane and Greg was like bleeding in front of sharks. It only invited more lectures about my dramatic behavior. I deleted the drafted text. I locked the phone screen and shoved the device into my small purse. A fresh wave of nausea washed over me, twisting my empty stomach. Dark spots danced across the edges of my vision, swirling like ink dropped in a glass of water. I leaned heavily against the sink, gripping the ceramic edge until my knuckles turned white. I was experiencing a severe medical crisis, stripped of my health insurance by my own father, entirely alone in a sweltering apartment. The logical, rational choice was to dial emergency services. I knew my body was failing. Logic was entirely overshadowed by a dark, burning spite. The anger burning in my chest rivaled the physical pain of my failing heart. I refused to let them win. I refused to let Savannah's yacht party become the only milestone our family acknowledged this weekend. I was going to walk across that stage and take my diploma if I had to drag myself on my hands and knees. I opened a rideshare application and ordered a car. Walking down the 3 flights of concrete stairs from my apartment was an exercise in pure agony. Each downward step sent a shockwave of pressure directly into my chest. The humid morning air hit me like a physical wall the moment I pushed open the lobby doors. A silver sedan pulled up to the curb a few minutes later. The driver, an older man with kind eyes and silver hair, took one look at my pale, sweating face and immediately rolled down the window. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked, concern evident in his raspy voice. "Do you need some water or a minute to catch your breath?" I shook my head, managing a tight, unconvincing smile as I climbed into the back seat. "I am just a little nervous," I lied. "Please take me to the university stadium." The driver nodded and pulled away from the curb. I sat in the back, resting my forehead against the cool glass of the window. The suburban landscape of Texas blurred past in a smear of green trees and gray concrete. I focused all my remaining energy on the rhythm of the tires humming against the asphalt. My body was rapidly deteriorating, but my mind remained laser-focused on the objective. I pictured Grandma Rose sitting in that front row. She possessed the leverage. The secure lockbox was in her control. I just had to deliver my end of the bargain. I had to show up and claim the degree that proved I was more than their forgotten daughter. The rideshare navigated the heavy traffic surrounding the campus and finally pulled up to the stadium entrance. The scene outside the arena was a chaotic festival of joy. Thousands of people swarmed the concrete plazas. Fathers adjusted their sons' ties, laughing and patting them on the back. Mothers pinned delicate corsages onto their daughters' lapels, dabbing away happy tears. Grandparents posed for group photographs, holding vast bouquets of bright flowers and colorful mylar balloons. The air hummed with overlapping voices, proud declarations, and pure, unfiltered celebration. I stepped out of the car into this ocean of love, feeling like a solitary island of pain. Every direction I looked, families were wrapping their arms around their graduates. The stark contrast between their reality and mine felt like a physical blow to my ribs. I waded through the dense crowd, pulling my secondhand black gown tighter around my shoulders to hide the trembling of my arms. My breathing grew dangerously shallow. A cold sweat soaked the back of my cheap dress, pasting the fabric to my skin. I placed my right hand flat against my chest, pressing right over my erratic, stumbling heart. The giant glass doors of the stadium loomed ahead. Inside, the arena seats were quickly filling up. The dean would soon take the podium to begin calling the names of the honors graduates. I looked up at the towering structure, gritting my teeth against another sharp flare of pain in my left arm. I told myself I just had to survive the next 2 hours. I had to keep my legs moving forward one agonizing step at a time. I stepped through the grand entrance, leaving the bright Texas morning behind and entering the glaring artificial lights of the staging area. I thought the hardest part of the day was reading that casual text message from my mother. I did not realize that the real climax, the moment my physical limits would finally shatter in front of thousands of people, was waiting for me right at the edge of the stage. The indoor stadium swallowed me the moment I crossed the threshold. The noise was a physical entity, a vibrating wall of sound that pressed against my eardrums. 3,000 graduates dressed in dark synthetic gowns shuffled down the concrete aisles, forming long, restless rows of folding chairs. Above us, the stadium's seating rose in steep, towering tiers. Every single section was packed shoulder to shoulder with elated families. The industrial air conditioning system struggled against the sheer volume of human bodies and the oppressive Texas climate waiting just outside the glass doors. I navigated the labyrinth of chairs and found my assigned seat in the honors section. I sank onto the hard plastic, my muscles immediately protesting the movement. My breathing came in short, jagged intervals. The girl sitting next to me was practically vibrating with nervous energy. She kept turning around to wave at a cluster of people holding a glittery poster board in the second deck. She caught my eye and offered a brilliant, wide smile. I tried to return the gesture, but my facial muscles felt stiff, locked in a rigid grimace. I turned my focus forward, fixing my gaze on the area designated for the families of the highest-ranking graduates. The university positioned these padded seats directly below the main stage. Row A, seats 1 through 3. That was my designated block. 2 of the chairs were occupied by strangers who had spilled over from an adjacent reservation. The 3rd chair remained conspicuously, painfully empty. I stared at that vacant seat. It was a glaring hole in the fabric of the celebration. The opening remarks began. The university president took his place at the heavy wooden podium. His voice boomed through the suspended speaker arrays, echoing off the high vaulted ceiling. He spoke eloquently about the limitless potential of the graduating class. He talked about the vital importance of safety nets, praising the parents in the audience for providing the unconditional love and financial backing that pushed us toward this milestone. The irony tasted like cold copper in my mouth. I had no safety net. My safety net was currently hovering thousands of feet over the Gulf of Mexico, clinking crystal flutes and complaining about the catering on a chartered yacht. I placed my hands flat on my lap. I noticed my fingernails carried a strange bluish tint. A cold sweat traced a slow path down my spine, chilling me, despite the suffocating ambient heat of the arena. My heart fluttered in my chest like a trapped bird beating its wings frantically against a cage. The rhythm was entirely wrong. It would race at a terrifying speed for 10 seconds, then slow to a heavy, agonizing crawl that made my vision dim. The dean of the sociology department stepped up to the microphone. The formal presentation of degrees commenced. The alphabet moved with terrifying, relentless speed. Adams, Baker, Barnes. The stadium erupted for every single name. Air horns blasted from the upper deck, slicing through the air. Families shrieked their approval in unbridled delight. The sheer volume of the celebration reverberated in my skull, amplifying the throbbing pressure behind my eyes. I gripped the edges of my plastic chair, waiting for the letter C. Carter Willow, the dean announced. His voice rolled across the vast space. Summa cum laude. A polite, scattered applause drifted from the surrounding crowd. There were no air horns for me. There were no shrieking relatives jumping to their feet. I pushed down on the armrest and forced my body upward. My legs felt like columns of solid lead, heavy and entirely detached from my brain. The distance from my row to the stage ramp was perhaps 50 feet, but it stretched out before me like a desolate, insurmountable highway. I stepped out into the center aisle. The arena floor seemed to tilt sharply to the left. I threw my hand out, my knuckles grazing the shoulder of a passing classmate to keep my balance. I kept my eyes locked on the wooden ramp leading up to the platform, one foot in front of the other. The pain in my chest was no longer a dull ache. It was no longer a sharp, isolated warning. It had evolved into a crushing, mechanical pressure. It felt as though an industrial vice had clamped directly over my sternum, the metal jaws turning tighter and tighter with every agonizing step. The oxygen in the vast room thinned out into absolute nothingness. I was opening my mouth, taking deep, ragged breaths, but my lungs refused to process the air. The sensation of impending doom, a clinical symptom of a failing heart, washed over me in a tidal wave of cold dread. I reached the bottom of the ramp. The staging director gave me a tight, professional nod, gesturing for me to ascend. I gripped the metal handrail. The railing felt slippery beneath my sweaty palm. I pulled myself up the steep incline, my joints burning with the effort. As I breached the top of the ramp, the stage lights hit me. They were a bank of harsh, brilliant white spotlights designed to illuminate the graduates for the professional photographers stationed below. The glare pierced my retinas, washing out the colors of the arena. The deafening noise of the stadium abruptly faded into a distant, underwater hum. My vision began to tunnel, a dark shadow creeping in around the edges of my sight until I could only see a narrow, illuminated sliver of the world ahead of me. Inside that narrow sliver, a sudden burst of movement caught my eye. Down in the VIP section, the empty chair was no longer empty. Grandma Rose had arrived. She was not sitting politely waiting for my turn. She was rushing down the central aisle toward the stage barrier, moving with a frantic, desperate urgency that defied her 80 years. Her silver hair was disheveled from the wind outside. In her right hand, she clutched a thick manila envelope, pressing the heavy paper tight against her chest. She held the leverage. She brought the weapon that would finally set me free. Rose looked up toward the stage. Her pale blue eyes locked directly onto my face. I saw the triumphant gleam of her arrival instantly shatter. I watched her expression warp from fierce determination into pure, unadulterated horror. She saw the sickly gray pallor of my skin under the spotlights. She saw my knees buckling beneath the dark synthetic gown. The dean stepped forward, offering a warm, congratulatory smile. He extended a leather-bound diploma cover toward me. I reached out my right hand to accept the document. My fingers brushed the textured leather, but I could not feel the material. My hand had gone entirely numb, a cold dead weight at the end of my arm. The crushing vice in my chest gave one final devastating twist. A searing white heat exploded behind my eyes, obliterating my vision. I gasped out loud a harsh, ragged sound that the podium microphone picked up and amplified across the entire arena. My knees gave way. I pitched forward, losing all control of my limbs. I watched the polished wooden planks of the stage rushing up to meet my face. My outstretched hand struck the heavy metal microphone stand, sending it toppling over the edge of the podium. The equipment hit the stage floor with a booming, thunderous crash that echoed off the high ceiling. That deafening noise was followed immediately by the collective horrified gasp of 3,000 people. The harsh white spotlights flickered and died in my mind. My vision went entirely black and my failing body slammed heavily against the hard wooden stage. I swam up through a thick, heavy layer of darkness. The transition from unconsciousness to waking was not peaceful. It felt like being dragged by my shoulders from the bottom of a freezing lake. The first thing that registered in my mind was the rhythmic, high-pitched tone of a cardiac monitor. The sound echoed off hard surfaces in a sterile environment. I tried to swallow. My throat felt like cracked parchment. A rigid plastic tube snaked across my collarbone, pulling slightly at my skin, delivering intravenous fluids directly into my bloodstream. I forced my heavy eyelids open. The harsh fluorescent lights above me burned my retinas, making me wince and turn my head away. As my vision slowly cleared, the blurry shapes around me sharpened into focus. The smell of iodine and bleached linens filled my lungs. I was in a hospital intensive care unit. To my immediate right, slumped in a vinyl guest chair, was Grandma Rose. She looked incredibly fragile under the clinical lighting. She wore the same formal dress she had put on for my graduation ceremony. The fabric was wrinkled, and dark shadows bruised the delicate skin under her eyes. She was fast asleep, her breathing shallow but steady. Resting squarely on her lap, pinned firmly beneath her folded hands, was that thick manila envelope. Even in sheer exhaustion, she guarded our leverage. Looking at her, I remembered stories about my grandfather, Henry. Henry was a man who built his fortune by anticipating disasters. He never trusted the volatile stock market. He invested heavily in commercial real estate across Texas, acquiring vast tracts of land before the suburban boom transformed the state. He always told Rose to keep a tight grip on the deeds because land meant permanence, land meant power. Now sitting in an uncomfortable hospital chair, Rose was wielding that exact power to shield me from the people who were supposed to be my parents. A young nurse wearing navy blue scrubs stepped into the room. She noticed my open eyes and immediately rushed over to the side of the bed. She pulled a small penlight from her pocket and checked my pupils. "You gave us quite a scare today, honey," she whispered, recording a note on a digital tablet. "You have been unresponsive for 3 days. Your body went into a state of severe shock. We diagnosed you with stress-induced cardiomyopathy. Some people call it broken heart syndrome. The chronic physical exhaustion and the extreme emotional trauma caused the main pumping chamber of your heart to enlarge and weaken to a dangerous level. We had to perform a minor surgical procedure to stabilize your rhythm." The gravity of her words settled heavily over me. I had been unconscious for 3 days. My first coherent thought was not about my recovery or the state of my heart. My first thought was a symptom of the brutal American healthcare system. Insurance. I croaked, my voice sounding like crushed gravel. I do not have active coverage. My father canceled my policy. The nurse paused, offering a deeply pitying look. "You do not need to worry about the hospital billing department," she replied softly. "Your grandmother stepped in the moment the ambulance brought you through the emergency doors. She presented legal documentation from your grandfather's estate. She signed all the emergency consent forms and provided a trust account routing number that covered your entire medical deductible up front. You are fully protected. No one can deny you care." The relief was staggering. The iron bands that had been squeezing my lungs for weeks finally loosened. I let my head fall back against the pillows. The nurse adjusted my medication drip and quietly slipped out of the room to notify the attending physician. I slowly turned my head toward the small plastic nightstand beside the bed. My personal belongings had been placed in a clear plastic bag, but my cell phone sat next to a plastic water pitcher plugged into a wall charger. I reached out. My arm felt weak, the muscles trembling with the effort, but I managed to grasp the device. I pulled it onto my chest and tapped the dark screen. A staggering wall of notifications flooded the display. 65 missed calls from Greg, 40 missed calls from Diane. I stared at the numbers. A sudden foolish warmth bloomed in my battered chest. My heart gave a weak, hopeful flutter against my ribs. They called. They called over 100 times. For a fraction of a second, the desperate, neglected child inside me believed the ultimate fantasy. I believed that watching me collapse on a public stage had finally shattered their vanity. I thought my near-death experience had terrified them into realizing they actually loved me. I thought they were frantically trying to reach the hospital to see if their youngest daughter had survived the cardiac failure. I unlocked the phone with a shaking thumb and opened my text messages. I clicked on the message thread from my father. The first message was sent on Saturday afternoon, just hours after I fell on the graduation stage. It did not ask if I was breathing. It did not ask which hospital I was in. It read, "Willow, tell your grandmother to pick up the phone right now." The second message, sent an hour later, escalated in tone. "Willow, what is Rose doing with the Texas property deed? Call me back this instant." My stomach plummeted. The foolish warmth in my chest vanished, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. I kept scrolling down the screen. The messages from my mother were equally frantic and entirely devoid of maternal concern. "Willow, call me immediately," Diane wrote, Savannah's fiancés. "Parents are asking questions about the estate. Preston is threatening to cancel the country club deposit. Why is the bank denying our card transactions? Do not do this to your sister." The notifications painted a vivid, horrifying picture of the last 3 days. They were not calling because their daughter was lying in an intensive care unit with a failing heart. They were calling because Grandma Rose had executed the contents of the manila envelope. While I was unconscious, fighting for my life, Rose had systematically cut off their access to Henry's wealth. The frantic missed calls were not an expression of parental grief or regret. They were an expression of pure financial panic. Their luxury vacation was unraveling, and they expected the daughter they abandoned to fix it from a hospital bed. I dropped the phone onto the sterile white blanket. The silence of the hospital room felt deafening, broken only by the steady beep of the cardiac monitor. The last remaining illusion I held about my family evaporated into the cold, sanitized air. I realized they would gladly step over my hospital bed if it meant securing a wedding venue deposit. As I lay there staring at the ceiling tiles, the grief transformed into a profound psychological clarity. I finally understood the fundamental truth about Diane and Greg. I saw the mechanics of their toxic behavior stripped of all pretenses, setting the stage for the final severance that was rapidly approaching. I lay in the sterile hospital bed, holding the phone against my chest. The glowing screen eventually went dark, leaving me to stare up at the ceiling tiles of the intensive care unit. The rhythmic sound of the cardiac monitor provided a steady metronome for my racing thoughts. For 22 years, I believed I was the problem. I believed that my inability to secure my parents' affection was a personal failure. I thought if I just earned higher grades, worked more hours, and demanded less space, they would eventually reward me with the love they showered on my sister. Reading those frantic text messages stripped away that illusion entirely. The messages demanding access to bank accounts and property deeds, while I was recovering from heart failure, functioned like a skeleton key. They unlocked the complex, toxic machinery of my family dynamic. As the shock of their indifference faded, a profound psychological clarity took its place. The truth of my entire childhood snapped into focus with devastating precision. My mother did not start her life in the sprawling suburban mansions she now frequents. Diane grew up in a cramped, noisy duplex in a rough neighborhood near the Gulf Coast. Her family lived paycheck to paycheck, constantly navigating the anxiety of utility shutoffs and empty pantries. She spent her entire youth wearing hand-me-down clothing and watching other people enjoy the comfort she was denied. Diane clawed her way into the middle class by marrying my father, but the middle class was never enough for her. She was terrified of sliding backward. She spent her entire adulthood trying to scrub the gritty reality of her origins out of her life. She curated an aesthetic of flawless, effortless wealth to mask the deep, lingering shame of her childhood poverty. Savannah was the ultimate manifestation of that manufactured aesthetic. My sister was Diana's golden ticket to the upper echelons of Texas society. Savannah was beautiful, socially compliant, and perfectly willing to play the role of the pampered heiress. By securing an engagement to a wealthy Dallas real estate developer, Savannah was accomplishing the one thing Diane could never achieve on her own. She was buying them entry into authentic old money. Savannah represented everything Diane wanted to be. When Diane looked at her oldest daughter, she saw a polished, refined version of herself. And then there was me. I was the worker. I was the inconvenient living reminder of the gritty reality Diane was so desperate to escape. I worked service jobs. I came home smelling like roasted coffee beans and commercial sanitizers. I wore thrifted clothes because I refused to ask them for an allowance. I navigated the world using sheer determination and manual labor. Every time Diane looked at me, she did not see a daughter to be proud of. She saw a reflection of the duplex she tried to leave behind. She saw the struggle. My independence was not something to be celebrated in her eyes. It was a direct threat to her worldview. By surviving without their financial subsidies, I proved that the fake, bought reality she worshipped was unnecessary. I proved that a person could build a valuable life through grit rather than social climbing. Diane actively resented my independence because it highlighted her own superficiality. She needed to frame me as difficult and rebellious to justify pushing me into the shadows. If she admitted I was capable and hardworking, she would have to admit that her obsession with status was a shallow, hollow pursuit. This dynamic was not just a case of simple parental favoritism. It was a textbook example of psychological projection. My father was equally complicit, though his motivations operated on a different frequency. Greg was a man who calculated everything through the lens of risk assessment. He was not a mastermind orchestrating the emotional abuse. He was simply a coward. Greg enabled Diane's delusions because enabling her was vastly easier than facing her wrath. A peaceful house was his highest priority. He knew Diane would make his life a waking nightmare if he ever challenged her treatment of me. He also knew that I was resilient. I would survive the neglect. I would find a way to pay my rent. I would figure out how to pass my exams. He did the grim mathematics of a coward. He decided it was safer to sacrifice my emotional well-being than to disrupt Diane's manufactured reality. Understanding this calculus changed everything. I realized they did not hate me as an individual. They hated what I represented to them. They hated the mirror I held up to their own insecurities. If you have ever experienced this specific kind of revelation, I want you to pause. If you have ever realized the toxic people in your life do not hate you, but rather hate the truth you represent to them, comment the word truth down below. Let me know I am not the only one who has had to decode the painful mathematics of a dysfunctional family. It is a devastating realization to swallow. Recognizing that your parents neglected you because of their own unhealed trauma is a bitter pill, but it is also the key to unlocking your own chains. For the first time in my life, the heavy burden of trying to be worthy of their love simply vanished. You cannot earn the affection of people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You cannot prove your value to someone who needs you to be worthless so they can feel superior. I spent 2 decades twisting myself into knots, trying to solve a puzzle that was fundamentally rigged against me. Lying in that hospital bed, listening to the steady rhythm of my recovering heart, I decided to stop playing their game entirely. The sound of rustling fabric pulled me out of my thoughts. I turned my head on the pillow. Grandma Rose was stirring awake in the vinyl guest chair next to me. She blinked against the harsh fluorescent lights, her pale blue eyes finding mine. She sat up slowly wincing as her stiff joints protested the movement. She smoothed the wrinkles of her skirt and placed her hands firmly over the thick manila envelope resting on her lap. "You are awake," Rose said. Her voice was raspy from sleep, but it carried that familiar, undeniable edge of steel. "I am awake," I replied quietly. She studied my face for a long moment. She possessed the same sharp instincts my grandfather Henry had always relied on. She could read the shift in my demeanor. She saw that the desperate approval-seeking girl who collapsed on the graduation stage was gone. The medical crisis had burned away my illusions, leaving behind a cold, clear focus. "Your phone has been vibrating non-stop for the last 2 hours, Rose noted, gesturing toward the device resting on my blanket. I assume Greg and Diane have discovered the new reality of their financial situation. They sent over 100 messages I confirmed. They are furious about the bank accounts. They are panicking about Savannah's wedding vendors." Rose offered a tight, ruthless smile. "That is a shame," she said dryly. "Actions have consequences. Your grandfather built his estate to reward character, not to subsidize vanity." She stood up from the chair, bracing her hands on the armrests. She walked over to the side of my bed. She reached out and gently smoothed a stray lock of hair away from my forehead. Her touch was incredibly tender, a stark contrast to the aggressive financial warfare she had just waged on my behalf. "They're going to come here, Grandma," I said, my voice steady. "The moment they realize you are ignoring their calls, they will track us down. They will bring the fight directly into this hospital room." "I am counting on it," Rose replied, her eyes flashing with anticipation. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The quiet, reflective peace of my psychological awakening was over. The physical confrontation was imminent. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling my chest expand without the suffocating pain that had plagued me for weeks. The medical procedure had stabilized my physical heart. The truth had stabilized my mind. I looked at the hospital room door, waiting for the inevitable storm to arrive. The chains were coming off today, and I was finally ready to face them. I looked at the thick manila envelope resting beneath my grandmother's folded hands. The clinical silence of the intensive care unit wrapped around us, heavy with unspoken tension. I knew my parents were navigating a financial crisis of their own making, but the exact mechanics remained a mystery. I sat up slightly wincing as the intravenous line pulled against my collarbone. "What exactly did you do, Grandma?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "How did you cut off their money so fast?" Rose did not answer immediately. She unclasped her hands and slowly unwound the string holding the flap of the envelope shut. The harsh, fluorescent lights caught the edge of several thick, watermarked legal documents as she slid them out. She held the papers with a quiet, terrifying reverence. "I executed the final wishes of a very intelligent man," Rose said smoothly. "To comprehend the sheer scale of the trap my grandfather Henry laid, you have to understand his approach to wealth. Henry despised the pretentious display of money. He drove a modest pickup truck until the day he died. He believed wealth was a tool meant to generate security, not a megaphone to broadcast your social status. When my father Greg married Diane, Henry immediately recognized the dangerous cocktail of Diane's relentless social ambition and Greg's spineless need to please her. He knew they would try to live like Dallas royalty on a middle management salary. Rose tapped the first stack of paper. "This is the deed to the land your parents built their suburban estate on," she explained. "When Greg and Diane wanted to build that 5-bedroom house in that exclusive neighborhood, they could not secure the land loan. Your grandfather purchased the acreage in cash. He allowed them to build their house on his property, leasing the ground to them for $1 a year. He never transferred the title. Greg and Diane owned the drywall and the roof, but your grandfather owned the ground beneath their feet." My eyes widened. My parents constantly hosted lavish dinner parties, bragging to their neighbors about their prime real estate. They cultivated an image of absolute ownership and prestige. The entire foundation of their suburban kingdom was a mirage. Rose moved to the second document. It featured rows of dense legal text and several notary seals. "This is the family trust," she continued, her voice turning sharp. "Henry seeded this account with substantial liquid assets. It was intended to function as an emergency safety net for your generation. Greg and Diane were granted temporary signatory access with a strict mandate to use the funds for essential family maintenance and educational expenses." I stared at the paperwork, a cold knot forming in my stomach. The puzzle pieces were rapidly falling into place. "They exploited the definition of family maintenance," Rose stated, confirming my worst suspicion. "For the past 4 years, while you were pulling espresso shots at dawn and eating expired bakery items to survive, your parents were quietly siphoning this trust. They used legal gray areas to classify Savannah's luxury vehicle as an essential transit expense. They routed the deposits for the country club wedding and the Miami yacht charter through this account, disguising them as family networking expenditures. The revelation hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The oxygen felt thin again. I was not just neglected, I was being actively robbed. The $80,000 wedding budget was not derived from my father's hard-earned corporate bonus. It was my money, my inheritance. While I was selling my bicycle to fix my broken laptop, my sister was strutting around in $1,200 crystal shoes purchased with my grandfather's legacy. They were literally burning through my future to buy Savannah's present. The sheer audacity of the theft left me speechless. I thought back to the moment Diane stood in my bedroom doorway, calling me selfish for refusing to run errands for Savannah. I thought about Greg, threatening to cancel my health insurance, telling me I needed to learn financial responsibility. They weaponized my poverty against me while secretly draining the safety net intended to protect me. "Why did Grandpa give them access at all?" I asked, my voice shaking with a potent mixture of anger and grief. "Why did he not just lock it away entirely?" "Because he needed them to reveal their true nature," Rose replied, her eyes narrowing. "Henry knew you could not tell a selfish person to change. You have to let them hang themselves with their own greed. But he was not a fool. He built an ironclad contingency into the trust charter. The temporary signatory access granted to your parents contained a trigger clause. On the exact date of your university graduation, their access was permanently revoked." Rose leaned forward, resting her hand on my blanket. "The moment that date arrived, the primary trusteeship transferred to my executive control with the sole legal mandate to disperse every remaining asset directly to a private account in your name. I processed the timeline. The graduation ceremony was Saturday. They planned the Miami trip to coincide with the exact weekend the funds were scheduled to lock them out. They were likely planning to drain the final reserves while sipping champagne on the coast, assuming they had a few days of bureaucratic grace period before the banks updated the trust status. They did not factor in your reaction, I whispered, looking at the fierce octogenarian sitting beside me. Rose offered a dark, satisfied smile. When I watched you collapse on that stage when the paramedics loaded you onto a stretcher and your heart rhythm flatlined in the back of the ambulance, I did not just sit in the waiting room and weep. I went to war. She described the terrifying hours while I was in surgery, while the cardiac team was inserting a catheter to stabilize my heart. Rose pulled out her cell phone. She called the estate attorneys in Dallas. She informed them that the graduation date had arrived and the beneficiary was currently fighting for her life in a cardiac unit without health insurance. I instructed the legal team to execute the transfer immediately, Rose said, her tone cold and precise. We froze the trust. When Diane tried to hand her premium card to the yacht catering service in Miami, the transaction declined. When Savannah attempted to authorize the final payment for her custom floral arrangements, the accounts were locked. Rose picked up the property deed and tapped it against her palm. Furthermore, I invoked my rights as the landowner. I instructed the firm to list the suburban property for immediate commercial sale to a developer. I terminated the $1 lease. My jaw dropped. You sold the ground under their house. The funds are already moving into a secure portfolio in your name, Rose confirmed. They traded your safety for a weekend of luxury. I traded their fake kingdom for your freedom. I looked at my grandmother, overwhelmed by a profound sense of awe. She was a frail woman in a wrinkled dress, but she possessed a tactical brilliance that dismantled my parents' entire lives in a matter of hours. The justice was poetic and devastating. Diane and Greg worshipped wealth and status above their own daughter. Rose simply took their idols away. The quiet sanctuary of our hospital room was suddenly shattered. Down the long, sanitized corridor of the intensive care unit, the heavy double doors banged open. The sound reverberated against the hard linoleum floors. I heard the frantic, rapid clicking of high heels marching down the hall. Where is she? A shrill, hysterical voice demanded. The voice belonged to my mother. Mom, you cannot be back here without a visitor pass, a nurse protested, her tone sharp and authoritative. Get out of my way, a deep, furious voice barked. That was my father. I demand to see my daughter right now. The heavy, rapid footsteps drew closer. The illusion of peace evaporated. The financial consequences had finally caught up to them, and they had abandoned their luxury vacation to deal with the fallout. They were not rushing to the hospital to comfort a sick child. They were storming the castle to demand their stolen gold back. I tightened my grip on the thin hospital blanket. The cardiac monitor next to my bed registered a slight increase in my heart rate, a steady, rhythmic thumping that proved I was alive and ready. Rose did not flinch. She simply gathered the legal documents, slid them back into the manila envelope, and folded her hands over her lap. The heavy wooden door to my hospital room swung open, hitting the rubber wall stop with a violent thud. The confrontation had arrived. The heavy wooden door to my hospital room slammed against the rubber wall stop with a violent thud. The confrontation had officially breached the sanctuary of the intensive care unit. Diane, Greg, and Savannah surged into the room. The visual contrast was absurd and deeply offensive. I was lying in a sterile hospital bed hooked to a cardiac monitor wearing a faded cotton gown. They were standing at the foot of my bed looking like they had just walked off a luxury cruise ship. They were quite literally sunburned from the Miami heat. Diane wore a wide-brimmed straw hat and a flowing floral resort dress. Greg was dressed in linen trousers and a pastel polo shirt. Savannah gripped a designer beach tote, her shoulders glowing bright pink under a sheer cover-up. They brought the stench of coconut sunscreen and stale airplane air into the clinical environment. Diane did not pause to look at the intravenous line snaking across my collarbone. She did not glance at the digital readout displaying my heart rate. She marched directly past my bed and stopped 2 feet in front of Grandma Rose. What did you do, Rose? Diane hissed, her voice vibrating with barely contained hysteria. The bank card was declined at the bridal boutique this morning. They humiliated Savannah in front of Preston's mother. Greg stepped forward, positioning himself next to his wife. His face was a dark, mottled purple, a physical manifestation of his unchecked rage. You had no right to freeze those accounts, he shouted, entirely ignoring the hospital setting. Savannah's wedding is in 3 weeks. We have outstanding catering deposits. You cannot just lock us out of our own trust. I watched the exchange with a profound sense of detachment. The cardiac monitor beside me registered a slight increase in my heart rate, but my mind remained incredibly still. For 22 years, I had feared their anger. I had twisted myself into knots trying to avoid setting off Diane's hysterical outbursts or Greg's cold lectures. Now watching them scream at an 80-year-old woman in an intensive care unit over a declined credit card, they just looked pathetic. I pushed my hands against the mattress and sat up. The sudden movement pulled the intravenous line tight against my skin, sending a sharp sting across my chest. "I had heart surgery, Dad," I said. My voice was not loud, but it possessed a dead, absolute calm that cut straight through their screaming. It was the tone of someone who had nothing left to lose. The room went entirely silent for a fraction of a second. Greg blinked his eyes, finally shifting from Rose to focus on me. For a moment, a flicker of something resembling human decency crossed his face. He noticed the tubes. He noticed the pale, sickly gray of my skin. Before he could process the reality of my condition, Savannah broke the silence. She let out a loud, theatrical sigh and rolled her eyes. "Oh, please, Willow, you always have to make it about you," Savannah scoffed, shifting her weight and crossing her arms defensively. "We had to fly back early from Miami because of this stunt. You ruined my bachelorette weekend. Do you have any idea how much money we lost on the yacht charter because we had to rebook flights today?" The audacity was breathtaking. The sheer, unadulterated narcissism required to stand over the bed of a sister who had nearly died and complain about a yacht charter was difficult to fully comprehend. I looked at my older sister. Savannah had spent her entire life shielded from consequences. Whenever she failed a class, Greg hired a private tutor to argue with the teacher. Whenever she wrecked a car, Diane bought her a newer, more expensive model to soothe her anxiety. They engineered a reality where Savannah's minor inconveniences were treated as global catastrophes while my actual survival was treated as an annoying distraction. "I am so sorry I interrupted your vacation by suffering a cardiac failure," I replied, my voice dripping with ice. "I will try to schedule my next near-death experience around your social calendar." Diane turned her furious gaze toward me. "Do not use that tone with your sister," she snapped. "You collapse because you insist on working those ridiculous jobs instead of just asking for help. You brought this on yourself. Now tell Rose to authorize the bank release. We need to pay the florist today." "You canceled my health insurance, Mom," I fired back, leaning forward. "You deliberately canceled my medical coverage knowing I was experiencing severe chest pains. If Grandma Rose had not been sitting in the front row at graduation, I would likely be dead right now or saddled with $500,000 in medical debt. You do not get to walk in here and demand money." Greg stepped closer to the bed, his corporate management persona finally surfacing. He raised his hands in a placating gesture, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "Willow, let us not be overly dramatic," Greg said, adopting his smoothest negotiating tone. Canceling the insurance was just a disciplinary measure. I was going to reinstate it on Monday. It was a lesson in family loyalty. You are fine now. The doctors fixed you. We need to focus on resolving this financial misunderstanding so we can get back on track. Savannah's wedding is the priority. He was bargaining. He was actually standing in an intensive care unit looking at the physical evidence of his cruelty and trying to negotiate a surrender so he could pay a florist. I stared at the three of them, Diane frantic and obsessed with image, Greg cowardly and desperate for control, Savannah entirely consumed by her own vanity. A weird, profound sense of peace washed over me. It felt as though a heavy chain that had been wrapped around my chest for 22 years finally snapped. The last shred of hope I had harbored for them evaporated into the sterile hospital air. I realized I was never going to receive an apology. I was never going to witness a moment of genuine parental reflection. They were entirely incapable of loving me, and more importantly, I realized I no longer needed them to. I turned my head and looked at Grandma Rose. She was sitting in her chair, watching the exchange with cold, calculating eyes. She had allowed them to dig their own graves. She had given them enough rope, and they had eagerly tied the knot. Rose Diane demanded, her voice shrill and desperate. "Fix this right now. Call the attorneys and unlock the trust." Rose did not flinch. She slowly stood up from the vinyl chair. She smoothed the wrinkles of her skirt and picked up the thick manila envelope resting on the small table. She held the legal documents like a loaded weapon. "I cannot unlock the trust," Diane Rose said, her voice smooth and deadly quiet. "The trust no longer exists in its previous form." Greg's face lost its color. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, stepping toward his mother. "The moment Willow officially graduated on Saturday, the primary trusteeship, Transferred to my executive control, Rose explained, enunciating every single word with deliberate precision. That was Henry's mandate. The temporary signatory access granted to you and Diane was permanently revoked. Savannah gasped, clutching her designer beach tote. You cannot do that. That money is for my wedding. That money was intended to be an emergency safety net for your generation, Rose corrected sharply. Your parents exploited legal loopholes to drain it for your luxury lifestyle. While Willow was selling her bicycle to afford a computer repair, you were buying $1,200 shoes. Rose turned her steely gaze back to Greg and Diane. I executed the transfer immediately. The accounts you have been using are frozen. The funds have been liquidated and transferred into a secure private portfolio registered exclusively in Willow's name. Diane stumbled backward, bumping into the edge of the hospital door. She looked as though she had been physically struck. You gave her everything, Diane whispered, her voice trembling with shock. I gave her what Henry intended for her to have, Rose replied. But I did not stop there. The temperature in the hospital room seemed to plummet. I watched my father's face morph from anger into pure, unadulterated terror. He knew his mother. He knew she did not bluff, and he knew she never left a job half finished. What else did you do? Greg asked, his voice cracking. Rose pulled the thick stack of watermarked paper from the envelope. She tapped the top document. I invoked my rights as the legal owner of the land beneath your house, Rose stated clearly. I terminated your $1 lease. I instructed the estate firm to list the suburban property for immediate commercial sale to a developer. The silence that followed was absolute. The beeping of my cardiac monitor was the only sound in the room. The full weight of the revelation crashed down on my parents. The financial fortress they had built their entire identity around was gone. The money was gone. The house was gone. The wedding budget was gone. The dramatic tension in the room shifted entirely. For 22 years, I had been the vulnerable one. I had been the one begging for scraps of attention and basic resources. Now, sitting in a hospital bed recovering from heart failure, the power dynamic inverted completely. The revelation was out in the open setting, the stage for the final devastating boundary I was about to enforce. Grandma Rose straightened her posture. Her frail, 80-year-old frame suddenly seemed to fill the entire hospital room. She held the legal documents with the steady grip of an executioner. Let me make this perfectly clear, she commanded. Her voice sliced through the stale clinical air like a sharpened blade. The house you currently occupy, Rose continued her tone, holding no room for negotiation. It was sold to a Dallas commercial investment firm at 9 o'clock this morning. They processed land acquisitions for high-density suburban development. They made a cash offer. The transaction is final. Furthermore, the trust fund you have been draining to subsidize your social climbing has been liquidated. Every remaining cent was transferred to an encrypted portfolio managed exclusively under Willow's name. You have exactly 30 days to vacate the property before the developers arrive to bulldoze it. Diane let out a sharp, ragged gasp. She clutched her chest, her manicured fingers digging into the sheer fabric of her floral resort dress. For a second, she looked as though she were the one suffering a sudden cardiac event. Her sunburned face drained of all color, leaving her skin an ashen, sickly hue. You cannot do this, Diane shrieked. The pitch of her voice shattered the quiet atmosphere of the intensive care unit. Preston's family will find out. The Covingtons run extensive background checks on all their business partners. Dallas society is small. Gossip spreads in hours. If his mother discovers we are broke, they will force Preston to cancel the wedding. They will never let their heir marry into a family facing a public eviction. I watched my mother unravel. Her primary concern was not the loss of her home or the well-being of her sick child. Her singular, all-consuming terror was the loss of her social status. She was staring down the barrel of a return to the poverty she spent her entire adulthood trying to outrun. Savannah dropped her designer beach tote. The bag hit the hard linoleum floor, spilling expensive cosmetics and oversized sunglasses. Her jaw hung open. For her entire life, her main asset was her proximity to wealth and the flawless aesthetic Diane curated for her. Now she was a liability. Preston Covington loved the country club pedigree Savannah projected. He loved the illusion of her stable, wealthy background. Savannah stared at our mother, genuine horror dawning on her face. Mom, what is she talking about? Savannah stammered, her voice shaking. Preston just signed the luxury catering contract. His mother invited her entire charity board to the reception. If the checks bounce, we are ruined. He will leave me. Grandma Rose looked at the panicking bride. A cold, ruthless smile touched the corners of her mouth. Then I guess you will just have to marry for love, Savannah Rose stated. The simplicity of the insult struck Savannah like a physical blow. She clamped her mouth shut, her eyes darting frantically around the room as the reality of her impending poverty settled over her. The severity of the situation finally penetrated Greg's corporate armor. Anger and intimidation were no longer viable tactics. He was a regional manager who had just lost his entire operating budget and his home in a single morning. His mind raced, calculating a new strategy. He turned away from his mother and focused his attention entirely on me. He took a hesitant step toward the side of my hospital bed. The aggressive purple hue faded from his face, replaced by a pale, sweating desperation. He shifted his body language, dropping his shoulders to appear smaller and less threatening. He reached out, hovering his hand over the hospital railing as if he wanted to touch my arm but thought better of it. "Willow, sweetheart," Greg pleaded. He lowered his pitch, adopting the soft, nurturing tone of a dedicated father. It was a manipulative cadence I had not heard since I was a toddler. "You have to fix this. You know your grandmother is just acting out of grief over your medical scare. She is being irrational and making rash decisions. But you have the power to reverse these transfers. The accounts are in your name now. You can authorize a wire transfer to cover the wedding vendors. You can buy the house back from the developers." He offered a weak, trembling smile. "You are our daughter Willow. You grew up in that house. We are blood. You would not put your own family on the street." I looked at the man standing beside my bed. He wore linen trousers and smelled of expensive coconut sunscreen. He was begging me to save the suburban kingdom he built on a foundation of lies. He was invoking the concept of family, a concept he had actively weaponized against me just days prior. He thought he could gaslight me into believing this was all a terrible misunderstanding. He assumed my desperation for parental approval would override my sense of self-preservation. My heart monitor beat a steady, rhythmic cadence in the background. The medication flowing through my intravenous line kept my pulse stable, but the newfound power in my hands kept my mind razor sharp. In American society, property rights are absolute. Capital dictates authority. Blood ties mean nothing when the deed is signed and the trust is sealed. I held the capital now. I held the authority. I met his desperate gaze. The terrified approval-seeking girl he expected to find was gone. "You took me off your health insurance a week before my heart gave out," I replied. My voice did not waver. It held no anger, no sorrow, and no desire for reconciliation. It was simply the cold, hard delivery of a factual truth. "You spent my graduation morning drinking mimosas in first class." I continued, watching his weak smile falter. "You chose a yacht charter over my survival. When the hospital called you 40 times to secure emergency surgical consent, you sent me straight to voicemail." Greg opened his mouth to formulate an excuse, but no words came out. The truth was an impenetrable wall. I sat up a little straighter against the pillows, ignoring the dull ache in my chest. I looked at Diane, who was weeping quietly into her hands, and then at Savannah, who was furiously typing on her cell phone, likely trying to secure her relationship before the rumors leaked. Finally, I locked eyes with Greg again. "I am not your daughter anymore, Dad," I stated. "I am just the owner of the house you are getting evicted from." The words landed with the weight of a judge striking a gavel. The finality of the statement sucked the remaining oxygen from the room. Greg's shoulders slumped. The corporate manager was defeated by a 22-year-old college student in a hospital gown. He realized he possessed zero leverage. He had nothing left to offer, and more importantly, nothing left to threaten me with. Diane let out a loud, pathetic sob. Savannah stopped typing on her phone and stared at me, realizing the free ride was permanently over. The dynamic of our entire existence had irrevocably flipped. The Carter family hierarchy was dismantled. I was no longer the invisible worker expected to subsidize their luxury. I was the architect of their ruin. The standoff in the hospital room had reached its peak, paving the way for the strict boundaries I was about to enforce. The silence that followed my declaration possessed a physical weight. It pressed against the walls of the intensive care unit, suffocating and absolute. I watched the three of them process the catastrophic shift in their reality. Savannah started crying. It was a loud, ugly sound far removed from the delicate manufactured tears she used to manipulate situations. These were genuine, panic-stricken sobs. She was not crying out of regret for my medical crisis or guilt for her own cruelty. She was weeping for the canceled floral arrangements, the lost prestige of the Covington Alliance, and the evaporated country club wedding. Her entire identity, meticulously constructed around an illusion of boundless wealth, was disintegrating in real time. Diane staggered sideways, her legs visibly buckling under the stress. She sank heavily into the vinyl visitor chair next to the door. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently beneath the sheer fabric of her floral resort dress. The carefully maintained facade of the stoic upper-class matriarch cracked completely. She looked exactly like the desperate, impoverished girl from the Gulf Coast duplex she had spent 3 decades trying to outrun. "We just wanted the best for our family," Diane sobbed into her palms. Her voice was muffled and wet. "We wanted to secure a strong future. We did everything for this family." I stared at the top of her head. The delusion was staggering. Even in the face of total financial ruin, she still attempted to frame her toxic ambition as a noble sacrifice. "No," I countered, my voice echoing off the sterile walls with a sharp, echoing clarity. "You did not want the best for our family. You wanted the best for your image. You wanted a prop to parade in front of your neighbors, not a daughter to nurture." The steady rhythm of my heart monitor punctuated my words. I took a deep breath, feeling the oxygen fill my healing lungs without the crushing, agonizing pain that had defined the past month. "I spent 22 years setting myself on fire to keep you warm," I continued, the words landing like heavy stones. "I worked myself into a cardiac unit trying to be invisible and compliant. And while I burned, you complained about the smoke. You complained that I was inconvenient. You complained that I was dramatic for needing basic resources." Diane looked up, her mascara running in dark streaks down her sunburned cheeks. She opened her mouth to offer another hollow justification, but I cut her off. The time for bargaining had passed. The emotional debt was called in and the accounts were closed. I raised my right arm, wincing slightly, as the intravenous line pulled taut and pointed directly at the heavy wooden door. "Get out," I ordered, "both of you, all of you." Greg stepped forward again, holding his hands up defensively. "Willow, please be reasonable. We cannot leave things like this. We need to discuss the logistics of the eviction. We need a timeline to find a new residence. We need access to a transition fund. You are no longer welcome in my life, my hospital room, or my future," I stated, ignoring his attempt to pivot back to a business negotiation. "You have exactly the 30-day timeline the commercial developers provided. I am not funding your transition. I am not financing your mistakes. If you linger in this room another minute, I will press the call button and have hospital security escort you out for harassing a cardiac patient." Savannah wiped her nose with the back of her hand, a thoroughly unglamorous gesture. "You are a monster," she hissed, her voice thick with venom. "You are destroying our lives because you hold a petty grudge over a graduation ceremony." I looked at my older sister. I felt no anger toward her anymore. The burning resentment had cooled into absolute freezing indifference. "I am not a monster, Savannah," I replied smoothly. "I am just a mirror. I am simply reflecting the exact amount of loyalty and care this family extended to me." Greg opened his mouth to argue, but the sheer unforgiving coldness in my eyes stopped him. For the first time in his entire life, the corporate manager realized he had absolutely zero leverage. He could not threaten my shelter because he no longer owned the house. He could not threaten my health insurance because he had already terminated it, and my grandmother had secured my care. He could not guilt me with familial obligations because he had spent my entire existence proving that blood ties meant nothing. He was staring at a stranger. He was staring at a young woman holding all the capital and the deed to his ruin. "If you attempt to contact me or Grandma Rose again, our estate lawyers will handle all communication," I added, delivering the final definitive boundary. "Any further harassment will be met with a restraining order. Leave now." Greg's shoulders slumped in total defeat. The reality of his complete powerlessness crushed his remaining bluster. He turned to his wife. He placed a hand on Diane's shaking shoulder and pulled her up from the vinyl chair. Savannah grabbed her designer beach tote, refusing to look at me, and bolted through the doorway. Greg and Diane followed a slow, shuffling exit that looked pathetic and broken. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind them, sealing the intensive care unit. The physical departure of my parents sucked the chaotic, frantic energy from the room. The clinical silence returned, broken only by the steady, reassuring beep of the medical equipment. I leaned back against the elevated pillows. I closed my eyes and took a deep, painless breath. The psychological warfare was over. The toxic tether binding me to the Carter family was severed completely. Grandma Rose walked over to the side of my bed. She placed her warm, dry hand over mine. She did not offer a grand speech or a dramatic declaration of victory. She simply squeezed my fingers, offering the quiet, solid presence of the only true family I possessed. "You did well," my girl Rose murmured. "Henry would be incredibly proud of the spine you showed today." I opened my eyes and looked at the fierce octogenarian. The immediate crisis was resolved, but the logistics of my new reality were daunting. I was a 22-year-old college graduate recovering from heart surgery, suddenly in possession of a massive commercial real estate payout and a liquidated trust fund. The wealth was staggering, but it was also a heavy responsibility. "What happens now, Grandma?" I asked, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly draining from my system. "Now we secure your physical recovery," Rose answered pragmatically. "The doctors want to keep you under observation for 2 more days to monitor the surgical site and adjust your cardiac medication. Once you are cleared for discharge, we execute the next phase of the plan." I frowned, confused. What next phase? I thought selling the house and liquidating the trust was the entire plan. Rose offered a tight, conspiratorial smile. "Oh, Willow, that was merely the defensive maneuver. That was securing the perimeter. Now that you have capital and autonomy, we must build the offensive strategy. You cannot return to your tiny, hot apartment. You cannot stay in Texas, existing in the same social orbit as Diane and Greg, waiting for them to attempt a legal counterattack or a public smear campaign. We need distance, and we need specialized medical care." She turned away from the bed and picked up an expensive leather tote bag she had placed near the window. She pulled out a sleek tablet device and woke the screen. "While you were unconscious, I had my legal team contact the academic advisors at your university," Rose explained, tapping the screen rapidly. "I requested a copy of your graduate school applications." My heart skipped a beat, but this time it was not a symptom of illness. It was a surge of genuine excitement. I had applied to several prestigious international programs months ago, a desperate secret hope I harbored while pulling espresso shots. I knew I could never afford the tuition or the cost of living abroad, but applying was a way to maintain my sanity. Rose turned the tablet toward me. Displayed on the screen was an official acceptance letter. It was from a world-renowned university located thousands of miles across the Atlantic Ocean. "The admission letter arrived yesterday," Rose said, her pale blue eyes shining with quiet triumph. "You were accepted into their premier sociology master's program. It is an incredible academic opportunity, but more importantly, it offers a geographic solution." I stared at the digital document, unable to process the magnitude of the offer. It was the exact program I had dreamed about, the one I had researched late at night in the library. "But Grandma, the program is overseas," I whispered. "How can I manage an international relocation while recovering from heart surgery?" "Because you have the resources now," Rose stated firmly, "and because that specific university is located less than a mile from one of the leading cardiac research hospitals in the world. We can secure you world-class follow-up care, a top-tier education, and an ocean of distance between you and your parents. The choice is entirely yours, Willow, but if you want to leave Texas behind, I have the logistics ready to execute." The proposition was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. The door to my past was firmly shut, but the gateway to an entirely new, unimaginably vast future was standing wide open. I looked at the acceptance letter and then at the fierce, loyal woman holding the tablet, preparing to make the most important decision of my life. 2 days later, the attending cardiologist signed my official discharge paperwork. My physical recovery was progressing steadily. The sharp, agonizing pain in my chest had subsided into a dull, manageable ache. The surgical site was healing clean. I felt weak, my stamina severely depleted, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. The relentless fog of sleep deprivation and financial panic was gone. I traded the scratchy hospital gown for a soft cashmere sweater and comfortable trousers Grandma Rose had purchased for me from a high-end boutique downstairs. I did not go back to my tiny, sweltering apartment near the university campus. The thought of climbing those 3 flights of concrete stairs made my healing heart flutter with residual anxiety. I did not have to face my landlord or look at the broken desk fan that provided the soundtrack to my lowest moments. Capital erases logistical nightmares. Grandma Rose hired a premium moving service. While I was finishing my final medical evaluations, a team of professionals packed up my textbooks, my thrifted clothes, and my sociology notes. They transferred my meager belongings into a secure, climate-controlled storage facility. I never had to set foot in that suffocating space again. A sleek black luxury town car waited at the curb outside the hospital discharge doors. The chauffeur stood at attention, opening the heavy rear door as we approached. I slid into the back seat. The interior smelled of rich leather and subtle vanilla. The climate control enveloped me in cool, soothing air. This car service was billed directly to the newly unlocked portfolio registered in my name. It was the first tangible purchase I made with my grandfather's legacy. As the vehicle pulled away from the hospital drop-off zone, I watched the sterile white building shrink in the tinted rearview window. The contrast between my arrival in a panicked rideshare and my departure in a chauffeured sedan felt like a surreal dream. The heavy Texas traffic crawled along the interstate, but inside the soundproof cabin of the town car, everything was quiet and still. Grandma Rose sat beside me looking revitalized. The exhaustion that plagued her during my intensive care stay had vanished. She reached into her structured leather tote bag and pulled out her tablet. She rested the device on her lap and turned toward me. So Rose set her tone brisk and businesslike. The defensive perimeter is secure. Your parents are locked out. The eviction clock is ticking. You possess more liquid capital than most corporate executives. What are we doing with our freedom? The question hung in the cool air of the cabin. Freedom is a terrifying concept when you have spent your entire existence trapped in a cage of scarcity. Having choices requires exercising a muscle I never knew how to use. I pulled my own smartphone from my purse. I opened the mobile browser and navigated to a specific bookmark. It was a page I had saved months ago during a late-night shift at the library, back when dreaming was my only escape mechanism. I turned the screen toward her. I received an acceptance letter while I was unconscious. I explained, keeping my voice steady. There is a premier graduate program for sociology at Oxford University. It is a fully funded academic seat, but the international student visa requires proof of independent living expenses. You have to prove you can sustain yourself in the United Kingdom without relying on public funds. I could never afford the cost of living or the visa fees. It was a pipe dream. Rose adjusted her reading glasses and scanned the digital acceptance letter. The United Kingdom, she mused, tapping her manicured fingernail against the edge of the tablet. That is a significant geographic relocation, Willow. It solves multiple problems simultaneously, I countered, feeling a surge of genuine excitement replace my lingering fatigue. First, it puts an ocean between us and Greg and Diane. They cannot ambush me at a local grocery store or stage a scene at my workplace. Second, Oxford houses some of the best cardiac specialists and research hospitals in the world. My attending physician here already warned me that my stress-induced cardiomyopathy requires strict long-term monitoring. The medical infrastructure in London and Oxford is top tier. I can secure an elite medical team for my follow-up care without navigating the fractured American insurance system. Rose did not blink. She did not ask for a pros and cons list. She did not hesitate or caution me about the risks of international relocation. She simply looked over her glasses, her pale blue eyes shining with fierce approval. "Book it," she commanded. My breath hitched. The authorization was so simple, so devoid of the manipulative strings my parents always attached to their money. I opened the airline application on my phone. My fingers trembled slightly as I navigated the booking interface. I bypassed the economy section, a reflex born from years of poverty, and selected the first-class cabin for a direct flight from Dallas to London Heathrow. The doctors had cleared me to fly only under the condition that I could lie flat and remain entirely stress-free during the transit. The exorbitant price tag displayed on the screen would have previously fed me for 2 years. Now it represented a mere fraction of the daily interest generating in my private portfolio. I selected 2 passengers. Rose noticed the total fare on the screen and raised an eyebrow. "I only see 1 graduate student sitting here," she noted dryly. "You do not need to buy a ticket for me. I can return to my ranch in West Texas." I stopped typing and looked directly at her. "I am not leaving you in Texas. Grandma, Greg and Diane are going to realize very soon that they cannot reach me. When they hit that wall, they will aim their panic and their fury directly at you. They will drive to your ranch. They will harass you. They will try to contest the estate transfer. I refuse to leave you behind to deal with the wreckage they created." I reached out and took her hand. Furthermore, I added softly, "I am moving to a foreign country with a healing heart. I need my family, and you are the only real family I have ever had." Rose stared at me. For the first time since this ordeal began, a sheen of tears gathered in her sharp eyes. She blinked rapidly, her fierce composure softening into profound gratitude. She gave my hand a firm, reassuring squeeze. "All right then," Rose whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I suppose I should pack a warmer coat. I hear the English rain is quite stubborn." I smiled the first genuine, unburdened smile I had produced in months. I turned back to the glowing screen. I entered the routing numbers from the newly established trust account. I clicked confirm. The payment processed instantly. 2 digital boarding passes generated on my screen. One-way first-class tickets to London. We did not drive toward my old neighborhood. We instructed the chauffeur to take us to a luxury hotel suite downtown. We needed a secure, comfortable place to rest and coordinate the international packing before our flight departed in 5 days. As the town car merged onto the highway, leaning into the fast lane, a new notification pinged on my phone. It was an email alert from the estate attorneys. The subject line was brief and clinical. Notice of eviction served. I opened the message. The legal team confirmed that the commercial developers had officially delivered the 30-day vacate notice to Greg and Diane at the suburban property. The quiet, bureaucratic machinery of their downfall was officially in motion. Then a second notification popped onto my screen. It was an automated news alert I had set up years ago for Preston Covington Savannah's wealthy fiancé just to keep track of the social circles my family orbited. The alert linked to a fresh article on a prominent Dallas society blog. The headline read, "Covington Real Estate, Heir Halts Wedding Plans." Amidst whispers of bride's family financial scandal, the consequences were cascading faster than I anticipated. Dallas high society operated on a foundation of whispers and reputation. The moment the commercial developers filed the land acquisition paperwork, the public record updated. Preston's family, notorious for their ruthless business acumen, had clearly flagged the transaction. They discovered that Savannah's parents did not own the land beneath their own home and that a forced eviction was imminent. The carefully curated illusion Diane spent decades building was unraveling in the public square. I locked the screen and set the phone face down on the leather seat. I felt no urge to read the article. The drama unfolding in Texas no longer belonged to me, and the panic consuming my parents and the humiliation swallowing my sister were the natural yields of the seeds they planted. I leaned my head back against the plush headrest and watched the Dallas skyline recede into the distance. The conflict they created was reaching its peak, but I was already a ghost to them, riding away toward an ocean they could never cross. 6 months have passed since that flight crossed the Atlantic Ocean. I am currently sitting in the window seat of a brick flat in Jericho, a quiet residential neighborhood in Oxford. A persistent driving English rain beats steadily against the thick glass panes. The ambient temperature in the room is brisk, a stark and welcome contrast to the suffocating humidity of the Texas coast. I am holding a porcelain mug of Earl Grey tea, letting the steam warm my face. The scent of bergamot mixes with the faint smell of burning wood from the hearth. Across the room, Grandma Rose sits in a plush wingback chair. A fire crackles cheerfully in the grate beside her. She is wearing a thick wool cardigan, reading a hardcover historical biography. She looks healthier and more vibrant than I have ever seen her. The chronic stress of managing my parents' constant financial crises used to age her, pulling her shoulders down with invisible weight. Stripping them of her assets acted like a fountain of youth. She laughs more now. She sleeps through the night. My physical recovery mirrors her revitalization. The elite cardiac specialist at the university hospital assigned me a comprehensive treatment plan the moment we arrived. My heart muscle has repaired itself beautifully. I no longer experience those terrifying jagged pains radiating down my arm when I climb a flight of stairs. My pulse is steady and calm. My academic life is equally stable. The sociology master's program is incredibly demanding, requiring hours of intense research and theoretical debate, but it is a joyous labor. I am no longer studying in stolen moments between minimum wage service shifts. I'm a fully funded scholar respected by my peers and supported by my professors. The ocean separating us from the United States acted as an impenetrable shield. Greg and Diane possessed no means to reach us physically. They did not have the surplus funds to purchase international plane tickets, and they certainly did not know our residential address. However, information still flows across the digital divide. The updates regarding the Carter family fallout arrive systematically through extended relatives. My father's sister, Aunt Barbara, functions as the unofficial historian of the family network. Barbara always harbored a quiet disdain for Diane's pretentious social climbing. This morning, Barbara forwarded me a long, detailed email outlining the final, devastating collapse of my parents' suburban kingdom. The initial domino fell with Savannah's engagement. The Covington family operates their real estate empire with ruthless precision. They employ corporate investigators to vet any potential business partner, and they applied the exact same scrutiny to their future daughter-in-law. The moment Grandma Rose authorized the sale of the land, the county property registry updated the public records. Preston's mother discovered that the Carters did not own their lavish estate. She learned about the imminent commercial eviction. The social execution was swift and surgically precise. The Covingtons did not ask for a meeting. They did not request a polite explanation. Preston simply dispatched his legal counsel to deliver a formal termination of the engagement. They canceled the luxury catering orders. They withdrew the prestigious country club reservations. Savannah was unceremoniously dumped, stripped of her golden ticket to the elite class in a matter of hours. Aunt Barbara reported that Savannah was forced to sell her custom designer wedding dress to a discount consignment shop just to cover the credit card debt she accumulated buying shoes and accessories for a bridal shower that never happened. Without the high-profile wedding to maintain their illusion of prestige, Greg and Diane faced the raw, unforgiving reality of their financial incompetence. The 30-day eviction notice expired. The commercial developers arrived with bulldozers and demolition crews. The 5-bedroom house with the pristine swimming pool was leveled to the dirt, making way for a retail parking lot. My parents were forced to pack whatever belongings they could fit into a rented moving truck. They relocated to a cramped 2-bedroom apartment situated right next to a noisy, congested interstate highway in a far less desirable Dallas suburb. The loss of the physical house was only the beginning of their ruin. Greg's corporate career depended heavily on his polished image and his sterling credit score. When the trust funds vanished, his hidden debts defaulted. His firm passed him over for the regional director promotion he bragged about, for years assigning him instead to a low-tier desk job managing high-risk claims. Diane suffered the most profound psychological defeat. The fake rich facade she spent decades cultivating crumbled into fine dust. She lost her membership to the local charity boards. Her wealthy neighbors stopped returning her phone calls, treating her sudden poverty like a contagious disease. Aunt Barbara wrote that Diane rarely leaves the cramped apartment now. The shame of being exposed as a fraud keeps her trapped inside. Without my unpaid labor to run their errands, and without my grandfather's money to fund their luxury, they have nothing left but each other. Over the past 4 weeks, a digital paper trail of their desperation began appearing in my university email inbox. Greg and Diane managed to acquire my academic contact information. They sent dozens of messages. The tone of their communication underwent a fascinating evolution. The early emails were demanding and accusatory. They blamed me for ruining Savannah's life. They threatened to sue the estate for emotional damages. When those messages went unanswered, the tone shifted into pathetic bargaining. They wrote long paragraphs begging for forgiveness. They attempted to invoke the concept of family unity, hoping I would forget how they abandoned me on my graduation day. They shared pictures of their small apartment, detailing how difficult their new reality was. Greg sent a message last week, explicitly asking for a short-term loan to cover their utility bills, promising he would pay me back with interest. He used the exact same phrasing I used when I begged him for $300 to fix my laptop. The irony was so potent, it almost felt scripted. I read his plea while sitting in the university library surrounded by centuries of academic history. I felt a profound sense of detachment. I did not type out a vindictive response. I did not list their failures or demand a sincere apology. I opened the settings in my email client and created a specific routing rule for their contact information. Any inbound message from Greg, Diane, or Savannah is now automatically archived into a hidden folder. Before the messages disappear into the digital void, the server generates an automated reply. I typed only 2 words into the response template. It is the exact phrase they used to justify their neglect. It is the label they applied to me when they wanted to excuse their own parental failures. The auto-reply simply says, self-sufficient. I clicked save and closed the laptop. That was the last interaction I will ever have with the Carter family. For a very long time, I believed the opposite of love was hate. I thought my anger proved that I still cared. I assumed that holding on to the burning resentment was a requirement of survival. I spent years raging against their indifference, fighting for a seat at a table that was never set for me. I was wrong. The opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is pure, unadulterated indifference. Looking out at the English rain, taking a sip of the warm Earl Grey tea, I realized I do not hate my parents anymore. I do not hate my sister. I simply do not care what happens to them. Their crises are no longer my emergencies. Their opinions of me hold zero currency in my life. The heavy, suffocating chain of seeking their approval dissolved the moment I recognized my own inherent value. If you are listening to this story right now and you find yourself waiting for toxic people to finally see your worth, I need you to stop. You cannot negotiate your value with people who profit from your insecurity. You cannot force a mirror to reflect an image it was never designed to show. Take your love, take your power. Stop setting yourself on fire to keep them warm. Gather your resources and buy your own one-way ticket out of their shadows. You will be amazed at how incredibly beautiful the world looks when you finally decide to choose yourself. Thank you for listening to my story. Until next time. Looking back on that hospital room and the flight to London, I realized that surviving my family was the hardest thing I have ever done, but the profound peace I feel now sitting by this Oxford fireplace with Grandma Rose is worth every single tear. If there is anything my journey has taught me, it is 3 vital truths. First, true family is determined by who shows up when you have absolutely nothing to offer, not by the blood in your veins. Grandma Rose chose me when my parents abandoned me, proving that loyalty is an action, not a biological obligation. Second, you can never earn your worth from people who are fiercely committed to misunderstanding you. I nearly worked my physical heart into failing just to buy a fraction of the approval my parents gave away freely to my sister. Stop auditioning for a role in a family that refuses to write you into the script. Your value is inherent. It is not a commodity to be negotiated. Finally, I learned that setting a permanent boundary is not an act of malice. It is an act of absolute survival. Walking away from my parents wasn't selfish. Choosing my health, my education, and my peace of mind was the most profound act of self-love I could ever commit. Today, I am thriving. I am completely self-sufficient, but this time, it is entirely on my own terms. If you are sitting in the shadows right now, waiting for toxic people to finally see your light, please stop waiting. Choose yourself. Thank you so much for listening to my journey today. If my experience resonated with you, please like and subscribe to Hazel Tells Stories for more narratives about resilience and breaking free. Drop a comment below to share your own story. Until next time, stay strong.